The Sprite and the Chef. Written by Robert Eakins, narrated by Philip Eakins. It was a lovely, bright, sunny morning. The kind of morning that is full of promise. The kind of morning that leads to a day in which anything is possible. Pippi had a spring in his step as he set off from his home to begin his journey. Pippi lived in a small town which was surrounded on all sides by rolling hills and a huge number of sheep. Pippi's town had a train station right at its heart, and that was where he was headed. When he arrived, he would board the train that would take him into the city. The long journey ahead did not trouble Pippi. He was far too excited about the day that lay before him to worry about being squashed up with hordes of commuters on a dirty old train. You see, today, Pippi was to take part in a competition. A cooking competition. Out of over 5,000 applicants, Pippi and 9 other young people had been selected at random to cook for the internationally renowned chef Terry Bramley Spicer. Terry intended to sample all of the dishes prepared for her and select the one she enjoyed the most. The lucky entrant who prepared the winning dish was to be awarded a prestigious apprenticeship in one of Terry's high-class restaurants. Now, Pippi was a pretty good cook, it has to be said, but he had a trick up his sleeve. What was the trick, I hear you ask? Well, you are no doubt familiar with magic beans, but have you ever heard of magic peas? I didn't think so. Well, these were not simply magic peas, but magic mushy peas. How did Pippi create this enchanted pea-based recipe? Well, in truth, it was not his recipe at all. His beloved grandma had taught it to him when he was just a boy. Pippi's grandma had learnt it from her grandma, who had learnt it from her grandma, and so on, back through the generations. Pippi had asked why this knowledge should always skip a generation, but his grandma had never really explained it. I'm sure by now you're wondering what sort of magic emanated from this culinary creation. Did diners turn into fluffy little rabbits, hopping around the kitchen before miraculously changing back into humans, stunned but somehow richer for the experience? Or perhaps you thought a giant pea stalk might grow up into the clouds, leading those with a brave heart to all kinds of adventures. No, the magic contained in magic mushy peas was happiness. Pure, unadulterated happiness. It didn't matter what struggles you were facing. One mouthful of this wonderful concoction would lift your spirits to the sky. And more than one mouthful. Well, other than providing a healthy dollop of phytonutrients, and don't we all need more of those in our lives, a whole portion would provide you with all the confidence needed to tackle whatever lay in your path. This happiness did not last forever, it is true, but it lasted long enough for those that had consumed the dish to look on the bright side of any situation and enjoy the beauty in the world around them. Pippi recalled his grandma telling him how every Sunday afternoon for over 3 decades, her own grandma had taken a large saucepan of magic mushy peas from door to door, ladling out goodness and happiness to her neighbours. The town where Pippi's grandma had grown up had seen some hard times over the years, and great-great-grandma's neighbours had looked forward to the weekly deliveries. Now one should be grateful for one's gifts, and Pippi's grandma had always taught him to appreciate magic wherever he found it. However, mushy peas were not the most versatile of foods. If he were able to create magic chips, or French fries as our American cousins call them, well then he could spread happiness throughout the world. But mushy peas were an acquired taste, magic or not. Pippi had realized that to win the competition he needed to create a dish with instant appeal. A dish for which a portion of mushy peas would be a natural addition. He therefore developed his own recipe for double-fried monkfish in a real ale batter, to be accompanied by his rather excellent, extra crispy Hasselback potatoes. As competition day approached, Pippi's father had been an enthusiastic test subject, trying numerous variations of the recipe until perfection had been achieved. Pippi's adventures in cooking had begun at a young age, when his grandma had stood him on a chair next to the worktop in her kitchen and taught him how to bake cakes and cookies and all manner of wonderful things. These lessons almost came to an abrupt end when, on one fateful occasion, Pippi had sneezed into the mixing bowl, causing his normally unflappable and enduringly calm grandma not a small degree of consternation. But she had persisted, improving his skills and discouraging his sneezes until eventually, at the age of 8, she imparted to him the secrets of the magic mushy pea recipe. Pippi felt like he had eaten a bucket of the stuff. He quickly made his way through the streets of his hometown, and soon arrived at the train station. As Pippi walked towards the ticket office, he saw a young man sitting against a wall with an empty coffee cup placed on the ground in front of him. A few coins had been thrown into the cup by passers-by. Pippi noticed the chap's dowdy appearance and wished he had some magic mushy peas to give him. Still, Pippi felt that there was something he could do. After buying his ticket, Pippi sat down next to the young man, whose name was Chris, and shared a few minutes with him. He listened to Chris talk about his life, how he came to be where he currently was, and where he hoped to be in the future. In return, Pippi told Chris about his grandma and the competition, and about the happiness-inducing magical side dish he was planning to prepare. It was soon time for Pippi to board his train. He quickly called into the station shop for provisions, then returned briefly to Chris. The pair wished each other good luck. Pippi left Chris with a coffee in his right hand, a cookie in his left hand, and his spirits raised. Now everyone knows that, as a general rule, if you want to find magical creatures, you first have to travel to the furthest reaches of our planet. You must journey to the areas where most humans fear to tread. If you wish to see unicorns galloping beneath a beautiful rainbow, whilst ogres grumpily darn their socks and dragons sit patiently waiting for a knight to come and challenge them, then you will have to go a very long way indeed. Humans have long since banished most magical creatures to the outer edges of the inhabited world. This general rule certainly does not apply to sprites. You will find sprites in every town and city across the globe. Well, that's just it. You won't. Sprites are small, fast creatures that hide at the edges of our peripheral vision. They keep themselves to themselves, and although they can in fact be seen by the human eye, they do not wish to be. Whilst forests are their natural habitat, they have done very well indeed in the modern age, enjoying the fragments left in the bottom of your last bag of crisps or that lick of ketchup left inside your burger wrapper. Given that most people pay very little attention to the world around them, sprites are able to pass unnoticed through our streets and our homes, and few humans can claim to have laid eyes on one. I said sprites keep themselves to themselves, didn't I? Well, that's not entirely true. Sprites are playful creatures and not blessed with copious amounts of self-control or forward-planning abilities. They sometimes involve themselves in our lives for their own entertainment and sometimes just by accident. If you put your keys down in one room and they turn up in another, that's a sprite. If you see light twinkling in the corner of your eye, but when you turn, it's gone, that's a sprite. If you eat too many slices of pizza and end up with a dreadful tummy ache, well, to be honest, that's your own fault. But you get the point. Now, why am I telling you about sprites? Well, it just so happened that a sprite was sitting in a dark alcove just a short distance from where Pippi and Chris were making conversation. The sprite, whose name was Reginald, had been enjoying the last few drops of a bottle of pop that some thoughtless fool had discarded onto the street outside the station. Reginald and the other members of his family lived in the attic above the ticket office. The attic was filled with boxes containing old train timetables dating back to 1873. For as long as Reginald could remember, the attic door would be opened only once a year for last year's timetables to be shoved inside by one of the station's employees. Now it seemed that no one remembered there was an attic above the ticket office. Or maybe they had found a less dusty place to store the timetables. Either way, the attic door had not been opened, by human hands at least, for many years. Reginald had found his attention drawn to Pippi's soothing voice and had listened intently. He was intrigued by the story of the magic mushy peas, a potion of which he was previously unaware. Reginald decided that he needed to know more about this magical dish, so entirely unseen he followed Pippi onto the train. Unaware of the magical creature at his shoulder, Pippi spent the journey chatting with a lady called Catherine, who was on her way to visit her daughter Kim. Catherine told Pippi that Kim was at university studying medicinal pharmacology, and even though Catherine was not really sure what the study of medicinal pharmacology entailed, she was very proud of her daughter. Catherine told Pippi that she had been so caught up with work these last few years that she had not been able to see what was right in front of her, that she and Kim had begun to drift apart. Catherine said that it was time to make amends, and such amend-making would start with a shopping trip, followed by a slap-up meal. Pippi told Catherine that she seemed like a very nice lady, and he was glad that she had the chance to put things right. As the train pulled into the station, they said their goodbyes. Pippi then headed off towards the restaurant in which the competition was taking place, unaware of the stowaway that had hidden himself inside his jacket pocket. Pippi had checked the directions before leaving home, and it did not take him long to find his way. As he approached the restaurant, he saw that it had huge glass windows at its front decorated with large white swirls. As he entered through the main doors, he paused to admire the gleaming white and silver colour scheme inside. The restaurant was large and could seat around 200 guests. On this day, however, it was closed to the public, as the kitchen area had been given over to the 10 would-be chefs showing off their culinary skills. Pippi was greeted by the head waiter, who then led him through to the kitchen. Although Pippi had arrived on time, it seemed the other competitors were already there, standing at their workstations ready to go. Pippi was quickly introduced to Terry Bramley Spicer, who didn't seem especially interested to meet him at all. Pippi was then led to his own workstation at the back of the kitchen, greeting his fellow competitors as he passed. None of them seemed especially interested to meet him either. The restaurant had provided the ingredients that each competitor required. Pippi quickly checked the small fridge and cupboard by his workstation to be sure he had everything he needed. After he confirmed to Terry that everything was in order, she gave a short speech reminding everyone of the bright future that awaited the entrant that impressed her the most. Satisfied that these young chefs were suitably inspired, she wished them luck and started the clock. The competitors had 1 hour and 30 minutes to prepare their dish and not a minute more. Pippi had become quite proficient at making his special dish and calmly set about preparing the potatoes and mixing the batter. He soon realized, however, that he faced an unexpected challenge. You see, the mushy peas would remain standard, normal, and entirely unmagical unless and until the appropriate magic spell was spoken in their immediate vicinity. Pippi had not given any thought to how he would do this in a room full of people without giving the game away. After much deliberation, Pippi decided that misdirection was the best approach. When the time came, Pippi pointed towards the entrance to the kitchen and said in an excited voice, "My word, is that Maurice a la mode?" As his rivals turned their attentions towards the door, thrilled at the thought of meeting the infamous food critic, Pippi seized his chance. He leant forward towards the stove, his nose almost touching the bright green mixture bubbling in the pan. After a last look to check no one was watching, Pippi whispered, "The sky is blue and peas are green. Make us happy and serene." The other competitors soon realized that Maurice had not paid them a surprise visit, and one by one they returned to their respective tasks. Whilst Pippi's diversion had earned him a few raised eyebrows and puzzled glances, that was a small price to pay to ensure that the words to his spell remained a secret. As the allotted time drew to a close, Pippi peered into the oven and was thrilled to find that his potatoes were cooked to perfection. He checked the fish and was delighted by how sublimely crisp the batter had become. He then glanced at the peas, pausing briefly to admire their vibrant colour. Feeling rather pleased with himself, Pippi began to arrange his culinary creations on a gleaming white plate, ready to present to Terry. The little sprite had been watching Pippi closely, keen to learn for himself how to prepare the magical recipe. Unfortunately, Reginald found himself in a state of confusion, which is an uncomfortable place for a sprite to be. He was not the brightest light on the Christmas tree, but Reginald knew the spell that Pippi had uttered would not produce a dish filled with happiness of magical proportions. In fact, it would not produce any kind of magic at all. Reginald was filled with disappointment. He watched as Terry began to work her way around the kitchen, tasting each of the dishes in turn. Reginald doubted that boring old mushy peas would win over a master chef. He was just about to slip away, intending to find a chocolate biscuit to cheer himself up, when he saw Terry turn towards Pippi. Reginald hesitated, and it was in that moment that his mind turned to Pippi's encounter with Chris earlier that day. Now, although sprites are not malevolent creatures, neither do they normally concern themselves with the human condition, and they do not seek to solve problems for humans even when it is within their power to do so. However, Reginald recalled the kindness Pippi had shown to Chris and decided to do him a good deed. Without giving the matter any further thought, Reginald cast his tiny hands in the direction of the plate set out in front of Pippi, instantly imbuing the mushy peas with the magical gifts Pippi had spoken of. Reginald then recalled he had seen a half-eaten bag of chips on the pavement outside the restaurant, and swiftly flew off to see if it was still there. Terry eyed the plate which Pippi presented to her. She tasted the fish, nodding her head slightly. She She then tried the potatoes, a thoughtful expression on her face. Finally, reluctantly, she tasted the green concoction loitering at the side of the plate. In an instant, Terry's eyes opened wide. A huge smile formed on her lips. Her previous distant demeanor disappeared, and Terry's personality became warm and animated. She thanked everyone for their efforts, then announced that she did not need to taste any more dishes. She said that Pippi was clearly a gifted chef, and she was happy that she had found the winner. Terry offered Pippi a job on the spot, which she graciously accepted. She then informed the other participants that they would all be invited to a private dinner, for which she would personally prepare them a sumptuous 3-course meal. This invitation put huge smiles on the young chef's faces. Pippi, of course, was elated. Before he did anything else, he called his parents and grandparents to tell them the wonderful news. Terry did not wish to waste any time before starting Pippi in her restaurant. The head waiter booked Pippi a hotel room for the night, and the following morning his apprenticeship began. Within 5 minutes of Pippi arriving in her kitchen, Terry, who was back to her normal irritable self, requested that Pippi prepare more of his astounding mushy peas. Pippi was happy to do so, and after gathering the required ingredients, he set to work. The kitchen was noisy, and no one heard him cast his spell. He soon took the first batch of mushy peas to Terry for her to taste. Of course, without the involvement of the Sprite, they were simply, well, I think you can work that out for yourself. Terry tasted the peas, but she did not react the way she had the day before. She tried another spoonful, but still nothing. "This isn't right," she said with concern and more than a little annoyance. "Do it again." Feeling a huge amount of pressure and scared that his dream job was about to be lost, Pippi tried again. Terry then tasted the new batch of mushy peas, and once again she was disappointed. Pippi began to panic. He had done everything just the way his grandma had taught him, the same way he had done it the day before during the competition. Feeling confused, Pippi excused himself and found a quiet spot to call his grandma. He explained the situation to her, finishing with the words, "And I did the spell exactly as you taught me, word for word." Pippi's grandma fell silent for a short time, then she spoke softly to Pippi. "I'm afraid I have done you a great disservice. I made the spell up." Pippi was speechless. "You see, we always had such fun cooking together," his grandma continued, "and making mushy peas was a good way to encourage you to eat your greens. I didn't think there was any harm in it." "But you always told me magic was real," Pippi protested. "It is real," his grandma replied. "Those with an open mind will find much magic in the world." Pippi was not convinced. "So why did I feel so wonderful after eating them?" "I imagine it was the love that went into their preparation," his grandma replied. "Peas are also full of fibre, and you tended to get a bit constipated when you were younger." "Grandma!" Pippi exclaimed. He thought back to Terry's reaction the previous day. Why did the magic work yesterday, then? "I don't know, Pippi. Things often happen in life that you just can't explain." Pippi was dismayed but could not be annoyed with his grandma. He should have realized the truth a lot sooner. He thought back to the stories of his great-great-grandma distributing food around her neighborhood. He now realized it was her kindness and community spirit that lifted people's hearts, not magic peas. Pippi then remembered that his own father was an awful cook. That was perhaps what his grandma had in mind when she spoke of how the magic could skip a generation. Pippi sighed. He now understood the reality of his situation, but had no idea what he should do next. He thought about the time he had spent with his grandma whilst growing up. If there was one thing she had taught him, other than magic is real, and always wash your hands before preparing food, it was that honesty is the best policy. Pippi would simply explain to Terry that he had made a mistake, he was sorry, and he would leave quietly. He braced himself for what would no doubt be a humiliating experience and walked back towards the kitchen. Now it should just so happen that Reginald had stayed in the city, having found himself overwhelmed by the countless tasty morsels discarded by the city's residents into the bins and onto the pavements. Whilst perched on an illuminated sign hung above the door of a bakery, enjoying the sticky remnants of a jam donut, he had watched as two women walked by carrying numerous bags of shopping. They were laughing and joking together, clearly enjoying each other's company. Reginald was not always the most attentive of sprites, but he had recognized the elder of the two as Catherine, the lady from the train. He then recalled Catherine's conversation with Pippi, and was suddenly curious to find out how the budding young chef was getting on with his not-so-magic mushy pea recipe. Without pausing to give the matter any further thought, Reginald set off at great speed. He flew fast and unseen through the city's busy streets until he reached Terry's restaurant, arriving just in time to hear Pippi's conversation with his grandma. Reginald was sad to see that things had not gone well for Pippi. He listened as Pippi told Terry the story of how he learnt to make magic mushy peas. He listened as Pippi recited the spell that his grandma had taught him, and watched as Terry's face developed an expression of unrestrained shock. He heard the laughter coming from the kitchen staff who had gathered around Pippi, and noted that Pippi continued to tell his story in spite of their obvious amusement. Reginald wanted to help. Pippi was a kind person who deserved another good deed. Besides, there was just a small chance that Reginald was perhaps partly a tiny bit to blame for the mess that Pippi was in. But what could he do? It was not his place to change people's opinions or trick them into doing something they did not wish to. Neither was it within his power to bestow upon Pippi the abilities required to imbue his mushy peas with magical qualities. Suddenly, Reginald remembered Pippi's conversation with the lady on the train. What was her name? Reginald couldn't quite recall that particular detail, but he did remember what she had said to Pippi. Well, not exactly word for word, but the general gist at least. She told him that she had not been able to see what was right in front of her, and that had made her sad. But eventually she did see what was right in front of her, and then she was happy. Reginald thought hard, then made a decision. Taking care not to be seen, he left the cover of the cake tin he had been hiding behind. Reginald took off towards the ceiling, then flew high over the heads of the people below him. When he was above Terry, he gave a gentle sweep of his hand. No one seemed to notice as the translucent haze of tiny sparkles descended towards her, landing in her hair and on her shoulders, delivering to her a magical gift. What was this gift, I hear you ask? It was the gift of clarity. Now Reginald had no control over how long this gift would last, or indeed which elements of Terry's no doubt complicated human existence would become clearer to her in the following moments. He simply found a new hiding place, held his breath, and hoped for the best. By now, Pippi had finished telling his story and was waiting for a response from Terry. Terry said nothing. Was the magic starting to take effect? Or was Terry simply stunned into silence by the fact that one of her competition entrants had actually thought he could beat the others by casting a spell? We may never know. Pippi's heart began to sink. He had been proud to tell his story, even though he knew he sounded foolish. He would not have swapped those times with his grandma for anything you could offer him. Terry's lack of response, however, was starting to unnerve him. He just wanted her to tell him to be on his way, and then he would leave. But Terry was looking thoughtful. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but nothing came out. Terry's mind was indeed full of thoughts. When she looked at Pippi, she saw a young man who loved his grandma and was not afraid to say so. She saw a brave individual who was not scared of criticism or scorn. Perhaps most importantly, given the business she was in, she saw a talented chef that had developed his own recipe for double-fried monkfish in a real ale batter, accompanied by some rather excellent, extra crispy Hasselback potatoes. She saw the new apprentice she had picked rather rashly the day before, and knew for certain she had made the right choice. Terry walked towards Pippi and shook his hand. She told him that they would make a fresh start. She told him he had a bright future ahead of him. She saw the delight on Pippi's face. Then she excused herself, made her way into her private office, and made a phone call. "Dad," Terry said, her voice trembling slightly, "did I ever tell you how much I loved those Sunday roasts we used to cook together?" Now Reginald, it must be said, was feeling rather pleased with the way things had turned out, and in that moment of contentment he achieved some clarity of his own. He realized that there is magic in kind gestures, and that happiness can be found in the happiness of others. With a smile on his face, and feeling like he had eaten a Sprite-sized bucket of magic mushy peas, Reginald set off towards the station, ready to make the long journey home.